Hey buddy, Grandpa Gene here. I heard that you wanted to get into photography a bit more, and that you would like a camera for Christmas. So Grandma and I are taking care of that, and I just wanted to introduce you to the camera body of the camera I'm going to send down. Now, let me get this adjusted just a little. There we go. So I am sending down to you an Olympus camera. This one. It's the Olympus EM1 Mark II. That camera was the top of the line camera from Olympus when it was introduced, and that was back in December of 2016. So it was the flagship. It was the best camera Olympus made at that time. And I didn't buy it in 2016 because it was still really expensive then. But I waited until 2018 and bought it then. It's a camera that has a lot of neat tricks. And when Grandma and I were talking about giving you a camera, as you might know, I have several, and I tried to figure out which might be most fun for you. I initially thought maybe what's called a digital SLR, because I've got a couple of Nikons, but they're big and heavy, and they actually don't work as fast, and they don't have what's called live view, where you can actually see what your image is going to look like through an electronic viewfinder, because digital SLRs don't have an electronic viewfinder. They have an LCD screen for reviewing the pictures after you've taken them, but they do not show you the image you're going to get until after you've taken the picture. They show you the image you got, not the image you're going to get. And in a mirrorless camera, like this Olympus, you can set it to basically show you what the picture is going to look like before you ever take the picture. And I think that's a nice function. But importantly, they are a lot lighter, not as heavy as the digital SLRs. So we'll try this Olympus. If you end up thinking you would rather have a digital SLR, which is a much bigger camera with bigger lenses, then I have a Nikon with a really, really good sensor that I will be glad to swap out with you and give you that Nikon. But I figure the best place to start and the most fun, because it's got a lot of different tricks in it, functions in it that you don't see in a lot of other cameras, is with this Olympus EM1 Mark II. Now I will put a link to the online manual that you can download, so you can have the full manual. There are so many functions in this camera that you really need to spend time going through the manual to figure them out, because there is a lot you can do with this camera. Now, I'm going to start just telling you a little bit about the body, how you cut it on and off. The on-off switch is right here. It's just a little lever that you push forward to turn it on, and that you pull back to turn it off. Okay. I mentioned Olympus is pretty neat in what they do. On this camera, if you don't like turning it on and off with your left hand, you can assign the on-off function to a lever over here that you could reach with your right thumb while you're holding the body. You can do that in the menus. This is called a function lever. In the menus, you go down to the B. First you go down to a little cog, which is the more in-depth function menu, and then you scroll to the right and go down to the B. And when you get into the B, that's for the buttons and various functions that can be assigned. And you'll see an option for the function lever, and you can assign power to this function lever. I don't do that because there's other functions you can assign to this lever, and the manual shows you what they are. I may get to them as we talk about this. But one of the functions you can assign is what in the menus they call mode 2 for that lever, and that lets you switch between two different autofocus settings, or switch between autofocus and manual focus, whichever you want. There's only one thing that I wish was in that function that is not, and that is it doesn't change the face detection settings when you switch those modes. So if you had face detection on in one mode, it's still going to be on when you switch to the other mode, whether you want it to or not. There's a way to easily turn that off, so we'll talk about that. But I like being able to use that function lever to switch between two different autofocus modes. So I leave power over here on this lever. Now, you've used your grandma's camera some, so you know a little bit about how to take a lens on and off. Well, on this camera, there is a lens release button right here that you push in. And I don't know if you noticed with grandma's Sony camera that this button actually pushes in a little pin that locks the lens into place. Okay, so when you need to take the lens off, you've got to push this button in and then turn the lens while holding the button down. Turn the lens counterclockwise, or to the left if we're going from the top. Okay, that gets the lens off. If you can see it, right beside that button is the little pin that goes in and out and locks the lens into place. On the lens, you'll see a whole bunch of electrical contacts. Those have to line up in the right place. So that's one of the functions of that pin, is to make sure the lens is in the right place. The other is to just lock it on the body and make sure it doesn't get loose and fall off. Now, when you're putting it back on, you don't have to do anything with this button. You can leave it alone. There's a red dot on the lens, and as you know, I know you found this changing lenses on grandma's camera. There's a dot on the body, and you line those two up. Now, if it's an Olympus lens, like the lenses I'm going to send you, those all have a red dot. But if I ever send you, or you ever pick up a third-party lens, like a Sigma lens, because they make Sigma lenses for this mount camera, or a Tamron, or a Tokina, or Panasonic. Panasonic uses this same mount on some of its cameras, and actually this is a Panasonic lens that I have mounted right now. They may have different colored dots from some of those manufacturers. You still just line up the dot on the lens with the dot on the camera's lens mount. The Panasonic dots are red, just like the Olympus. But you just line up the dots, turn it clockwise to put it back on, and you want to listen, and I've loosened it up a little so you can hear it. You want to listen for the click when that pin pops back into place. Heard the click? Okay. Now, let me talk a little bit about either keeping your lens on or what's called a body cap. This is a body cap. Okay. If the lens is off, you need to put your body cap on. And I've got this body cap paired up with a lens cap that goes on the back of the lens. The reason you need your body cap on is that the sensor is very important, and they can kind of gather dust. And you don't want a whole lot of dust. You don't want your sensor to get dirty. So you want to try to keep the body sealed up, either with a lens on it or with a body cap on it all the time. Don't leave it sitting around with the sensor exposed, because it will start getting dirty. And you have to be very careful about cleaning a sensor. Don't touch it. Don't put an eraser on it. Don't put any kind of tissue or paper towels on it. There's specific stuff made for cleaning off a sensor. And outside of blowing dust off of it with a blower, and you need a blower that hasn't sucked up a bunch of dust into it, because then you're just blowing dust onto your sensor. You don't want to risk getting it dirtier or messing it up, because it can ruin your camera if you mess up your sensor. Be real careful around laser lights, because sometimes there's a laser light show in some of these places where there's parties for kids, and or at a wrestling match or something like that. They may do a little laser light show to begin with. It happens at concerts as well. That will damage the sensor, even with the lens on. If the lens cap is off and that laser light gets into the lens, it will mess up your sensor, and there's no way to fix that kind of damage. So be real careful around laser light as well. But you want to try to keep this sensor as clean as you can by keeping the body cap on or lens on, and then avoiding things like changing the lens in a really dusty environment, or if you're outside and it's real windy, you want to kind of shield the camera and the lens from all that wind if you have to change lenses in those conditions. If you don't have to, then wait until you're a place that there's no wind, so you're not risking getting dust on your camera sensor. Now, if you get dust on it, it's not going to show up in most images, but there may be times when you're shooting on a bright, clear day, and there'll be little dark spots that show up in the sky of your images from dust on the sensor. It can also happen on a clear white wall that's brightly lit, or a real light colored wall that's brightly lit. You might see dark spots that's dust on your sensor. One way to keep those from showing as much is to open up your aperture more. And by open up, I mean go toward the wide side. And we'll talk more about aperture in a bit, but like a wide aperture would be f2 or f2.8, f4. Those are kind of the wider end. And dust spots typically don't show up when you're using a wider aperture than when you're using a smaller one. And in fact, let me just see if I can show you this. This is an old manual focus lens that lets me change the aperture by hand. And right now, the setting it's on, it's just a tiny little dot in there. You see that tiny little dot in the middle? That's the aperture opening with this lens at f22. So that's what we would call stopped way down. Barely lets light in. And now it's kind of hard to hold this and get it turned, but let me see if I can. Yes, I can. Here we go. All right. I'm opening that aperture up now. You see that much bigger opening now that you can see through? That's letting in more light because we've increased the aperture. And now, for this lens, it's gotten to f2.8. f2.8. See how much light that's letting in at f2.8 compared to the much smaller opening as it was stopped down. So that's controlled by aperture blades in the lens that close down as you do what we call stop down, or open up as you open up the lens. And it lets more light in. So it controls how much light can come in through your lens. And That's something that we'll talk a little bit more about later. But when you're inside, you're going to need that wider aperture because inside light's not nearly as bright most of the time as outside. So you're going to shoot more toward the wide end of aperture. And it's going to vary by lenses too. Zoom lenses don't have as wide an aperture. And zoom lenses, unless they're professional zoom lenses, the aperture, the widest aperture, will actually get smaller as you zoom in on your subject. As you get more toward the telephoto end, the long end of your lens, the way they make the lens affordable and keep it small is it's a variable maximum wide aperture. So when you're at the most wide angle for the lens, you're going to get its widest aperture available. But as you zoom in, that widest aperture is going to get smaller and smaller. And I'm sending you a couple of zoom lenses that are light, very, very light, and very, very small for the range they cover. But one of the results of keeping it small and light is you don't get a very wide aperture when you're zoomed in on something real close. So keep that in mind. These lenses are made more for outdoors, the zoom lenses, than inside. The third lens I'm sending you, the one that's mounted on here, is a Panasonic 25mm lens, and it has a maximum aperture of f1.7, and that's how we call out apertures: f1.7, f1.8, f2, and the smaller the number, the bigger the opening is actually, because it's expressed as a fraction. The f stands for focal length of your lens, and it's focal length over, and then a number that gives you a fraction that represents the aperture. And so, f2 is, you can think of that as like the fraction 1/2, and the fraction 1/2 is twice as big as the fraction 1/4. Similarly, f4 in aperture terms lets in half the light of f2. Okay? And with each time you change the aperture, the opening either gets smaller or bigger depending on which direction you go. Now, let's keep talking about the camera body. And since we are going to talk about parts on the front of the camera body, I'm going to take off this lens, put on this body cap. If I somehow forget to send the spare body cap, remind me, and I will mail it down to Grandma when she comes down. So there's the lens release button. Okay. Up here is a little cap, a little black cap. It might be hard to see. Just leave that on there. That is a part that was used decades ago to fire a flash through using a connected cable. So this is called an external flash terminal sync, and it's SYNC. That covers up the flash sync terminal. Now, I've lost a half a dozen of these, and so you may as well. That's why I say just leave it on. Don't mess with it. Right now it's on good and tight. The more you take it off, the more likely it's going to get real loose and fall off, and you'll lose it. Like I said, I've lost a half a dozen, maybe more, and it's not a big deal if you lose it. It's $5 on Amazon to buy the part. You can find them on eBay too. You just search for Flash Sync Terminal Cap, and you can find them. It does look a little weird without it on there, because you see this open, brightly colored metal terminal there that the cable for the flash would plug into. and it might impact the weather sealing some of this body. You know, if you accidentally got caught in the rain, it might let water into the body, and you don't want that to happen because this is very much an electronic device, and water is not good for electronic devices. Water can kill your electronic devices. So try to leave that cap on, and you know, if you do lose it, and eventually it will come loose and fall off. If you can't find it, then let me know. We'll order another one. I can find one for you. Now, while I'm on the front here, there's two function buttons. One is depth of field preview by default. So if you press that, I think that's the lower one. If you press that one down, while you're looking through, the camera will go ahead and move the aperture to whatever aperture you want the shot to be taken at. And you can see a little bit about whether areas are out of focus or not. And if there are areas out of focus that you want in focus, then you need to change your aperture. And the more you get toward the bigger numbers, like f5, f5.6, f6.3, f7.1, f8, f11, the greater your depth of field gets, the greater the area in focus will get. My eyesight's not good enough for the depth of field preview to be much good, so I usually assign this to something else. But try it, see if you like it, see if it makes much difference to you when you're looking through it. Now, I think I've got HDR assigned to this upper button, and HDR is high dynamic range. That's what it stands for, high dynamic range. And that means you're taking a shot in an environment where there's some really, really bright parts, like either really bright lights or sunlight that's hitting some light-colored thing and really, really making it bright. And then in other parts of your scene, there's darker stuff, areas in shadows. You know, if you've got something that's in a deep shadow, it's fairly dark. And the camera doesn't have, all cameras don't have enough dynamic range in the sensor to take all that in a single shot and properly expose it for both the dark areas with the shadows and the really, really bright areas. So if you expose to make sure you can see some detail in the shadows from a single shot, and it's too high dynamic range of scene, then your really bright areas are just going to blow out. They're going to be overexposed, and you won't be able to see any detail in it. So, like if it's a bright day with white clouds, the white clouds will almost look like a white sheet of paper. They won't have any real detail to them if they're overexposed and blown out. So HDR takes multiple shots and tries to combine them. It does it at different exposures with each shot, so that it tries to get the shadows bright enough to see a little detail in them, and a shot that is exposed such that those really, really bright areas aren't blown out, and then it combines those shots. Now, for that to work, it's best to have your camera completely still, either on a tripod or a very solid surface. I tell you one little trick that I read about 25, 30 years ago, and that is put the camera on your shoulder when you need to try to really steady your camera. That can help too. So if you use HDR, you need to remember the camera's got to be really still. And you may think it's still when you're holding it like this, but it's not. There's always a little bit of shake when you're holding a camera like that. So, you know, elbows into your body helps a little bit, and camera using the electronic viewfinder helps because it will brace against your forehead, and you can get it more still than just holding your camera out like that. but there's still always going to be just a little bit of motion in the camera itself that can dull your picture. Now, this camera has a feature called in-body image stabilization. Short for it is IBIS, in-body image stabilization. And what that does is the camera moves the sensor around to offset the movement it detects of the camera. And Olympus makes the best in-body image stabilization of any camera manufacturer. So you can get away with using really slow shutter speeds and still get a sharp image as long as your subjects aren't moving. If everything's still, you can use a real slow shutter speed in this. And that's one of the reasons I like to shoot in manual mode, because it lets me pick the aperture and the shutter speed. And I have the feature called ISO, which is your sensor sensitivity. I have it set to auto so that the camera will adjust that, but it lets me pick the shutter speed and the aperture because I may want my aperture at f5 or 5.6 to give me a little more depth of field in focus, and the camera automatically won't go down to as slow a shutter speed as it's really capable of giving you a sharp shot on because of the in-body image stabilization. So that's a really, really good feature on the Olympus cameras. And some people say that they can get a sharp shot handheld, of course with the camera up to their face, for as much as a 1 second exposure at wider angles. And that's really, really impressive for a camera to be able to do that. So keep in mind you have that in-body image stabilization that can help you take slower shutter speed shots and still get a sharp image. Okay, let's keep walking around to the parts. I said there's 2 function buttons here. I think what I have programmed to this upper button right now is the HDR function that I just talked about, high dynamic range. On the bottom of the camera, we get to the battery compartment cover. Okay, so that's where the battery goes, and there's this little lever here that you have to push to unlock the battery. You got to be kind of careful with this because Olympus has used this same little mechanism on a whole bunch of its battery covers for different cameras. I just flip this one up, and then a spring pops it open. With that little lever, I've read lots of reports of it breaking. Now, I have multiple Olympus camera bodies, and I've never broken one. But it does happen. And because I've read about it and know it happens, I try to be really, really gentle. It may still break eventually, and I've read the parts are available on eBay to fix it. But just try to be gentle with it so you don't even have to mess with that. Okay, now, once the battery door is open, you will see there is a little tab up there that's kind of orange or red. That locks the battery into place. So to remove the battery, you just push that, okay? Push that tab, and the battery will pop loose because there's a spring in there that pushes it out a little bit. Now I'm going to turn this around so you can see it from the other side. The battery, if you can see it, has an up arrow. It has a directional arrow pointing what should be the top when you put the camera into the body. And when you're looking at it from the back, you want to see that arrow as you put it in. Now while I've got it in front of you, there's the contacts that the power flows through. And within the body itself, you probably can't see them, but there are little metal contacts in there that will line up. So when you have it in hand, you'll be able to see that. Now when you put the battery back in, you've got to get this little tab depressed by the edge of the battery. So I do it at a bit of an angle, set it on that, let it press down that tab, and then straighten the battery out, push it in. You hear it click when that little tab pops over the edge of the battery. Then you close the door, and it's like I said, be gentle. Close the door, shove that lever closed. So while this part is certainly likely to fall off at some point in time, not a big deal. This one, a little more of a pain if you end up breaking that part. Generally, these cameras are pretty tough, but they're a combination. All the cameras now are a combination of either some high-tech plastics or some metal alloys, plastic and rubber. This is a rubber grip that covers a metal alloy body grip. This is something that on a lot of different cameras will eventually come loose and maybe even fall off. If it comes loose, and being in the hot and humid environment that you're in makes it more likely that might happen, then just find some glue, if you can find some super glue or something like that, that says it's compatible with rubber. Because some glues actually melt rubber and make it real soft and gooey, and so that would just ruin it, and you'd have to either go without the rubber cover for the grip, and some people do that, or you'd have to buy a new rubber cover piece to replace it if you destroyed it with a glue that wasn't compatible. So keep that in mind too, as something to just kind of watch, and if it ends up getting real loose and starting to fall off, then you're going to want to try to glue it back with a compatible glue for rubber. Okay. Now, while we're going through the body, here on the bottom, you see a little rubber cover, a little rubber gasket. And what that covers is some metal contacts for, and I've got one here with it uncovered so you can see the metal contacts. It covers up that, and that is for what Olympus calls a power battery holder. They call it that because it includes a second battery in that holder, but I call it a vertical grip. This is the vertical grip for this camera, okay? And what it does is it screws into the tripod mount, and it's got a little pin that locks in up here to keep it in place, okay, like that. And then these contacts mesh up so that the vertical grip can communicate with the camera body and provide power to it. And the vertical grip gives you extra controls for when you are shooting in what's called portrait orientation, when you're shooting vertically like this. It's kind of awkward to hold the camera like this, so the vertical grip gives you a grip to be able to hold it like that when you're shooting vertically. I only use that when I know I'm going to shoot portraits in a vertical orientation. But if you were ever shooting sporting events for a whole day or something like that, where having that second battery already in and not having to stop to change batteries would be handy, then having that grip is nice to have. And those are available for about $120 online from stores like mpb.com. M as in Mary, P as in Paul, B as in Bob. MPB is a used camera gear store, and they sell everything from backpacks and tripods to cameras themselves, lenses, battery grip accessories, and things like that. Good store, KEH.com, does the same thing. They're out of Atlanta, Georgia. I've purchased stuff from both those stores, And a lot of the big camera stores have used equipment departments as well, like B&H Photo in New York, Adorama in New York, and I use Cardinal Camera a lot, and they are out of Pennsylvania, but they have a store in Charlotte that's really good. So anyway, try to keep that cover on because it does impact your weather sealing, and it's protecting important little contacts in there, electrical contacts. When you use a battery grip, there's actually a spot in the grip right there where my pinky is to put that cover so it won't get lost. And you may have noticed I didn't have the cover in there, so Grandpa's not following good practice here with that camera. I actually have that little cover in a drawer. But try to not lose that cover, try to keep it on. Okay, let's keep going. Next up, your screen. Right now I have the screen closed because you've got an LCD screen here that swivels out like that, and it will rotate, but be careful how you rotate it because it's pushed from the top when you're rotating it toward the front. Okay, and you can use that if you're doing selfies or you're recording videos of yourself. You can see it as you go in the screen. Be gentle in turning it because it only turns one way. If you try to force it the other way, you might actually break off your LCD. I was waving goodbye to Grandma. She's going to the store. So anyway, and one of the neat things about the screen is you can angle it to where it's facing down, so you can use the camera over your head like that, or you can angle it to where it's facing up and you can use the camera down low, like you can put it all the way down to the ground and still see what the image would be. So I like that. It's very handy, and you can store it either with the screen against the body so it's protected, or you can flip it around and store it to where the screen is out. Now, this is fine, but it doesn't protect the screen as well. So I usually turn it in, because if your screen's hanging, if your camera's hanging from a body strap, and I'm demonstrating with the wrong camera, here's your camera with a body strap on it, and it's hanging down, well, it might hit against some buttons. Plastic buttons usually aren't going to be a big problem, but if it gets down and hits against a belt buckle or something like that, it can scratch up and damage your screen. So I prefer to leave it in with the screen itself against the body when I'm just walking around not shooting images. And then I like to use the electronic viewfinder too, because as I said earlier, it's more steady for you. Now, when you use the electronic viewfinder, there is a diopter adjustment, and it's this little round piece right here to the left side, and you can push it up, rotate it up, you can rotate it down. When you first use it, you want to look through the viewfinder with power on, and if you see numbers down at the bottom, you want to scroll this up and down until those numbers get to their sharpest point where they look really clear for you. If you don't see anything at all in there after you've powered on, as far as numbers at the bottom, hit the info button. The info button scrolls you through different display options, okay? It tells you what mode you're in, it tells you what shutter speed, it tells you what aperture, and it gives you that information down at the bottom of the screen. Hopefully you can see it here. See, there's numbers down at the bottom. Now there's stuff on the sides too, but the bottom is the one that are biggest usually, and use those to judge if you have the diopter set correctly for your vision. Okay. And again, this hinge, be careful. You know, you don't want to bump this against something hard while you've got it out, because you could break the hinge. You want to be kind of gentle with this screen, because while the body of this camera is a metal alloy, the screen is primarily plastic parts with an LCD screen. And that's the way it is on all cameras. You got to be gentle now with the LCD screen on all cameras. Okay, so let's go to the side of the body. Hopefully you can see there's little icons on these covers for the ports. So down at the bottom is your USB-C port. That takes a USB-C cable. That is to connect your camera to the computer. It is not for powering. Now, my phone charges with a USB-C cable, but this camera itself doesn't have the circuitry in it to charge the battery through the USB-C port, so you have to take the battery out to charge it. So I am sending you a separate battery charger and a spare battery. And while we're talking about the batteries, it's fine to charge them to 100%. It's bad for them to let them get to 0. I have read that can help kill the batteries. I generally charge them to 80 or 90%, because 100% full charge and then just left out can more quickly degrade the battery over time, from what I've read. If it's going back in the camera, I don't worry about it, because the camera itself will use a little bit of power over time. And so make sure you check your batteries well before you go out, and make sure they haven't discharged so much that you don't have decent battery capacity left for when you're going out to shoot. Okay, now let's talk about, well, I didn't tell you what all the ports are. There's a micro HDMI port that can be connected via an adapter to a regular HDMI, so that you might be able to watch a movie you've taken by plugging the HDMI into a computer or into a TV. And there's a headset jack. It's not a bidirectional head jack. It doesn't do both service as a microphone and as a headphone. It just is a headphone jack. And then there's a separate microphone jack. Those are relevant for when you're taking video and you want to hear, if you wanted to hear the volume of what you are recording, then you're wearing the headphones. And if you want better audio quality than you're going to get through the little microphones built into the camera, then you're going to use an external microphone. And this camera lets you do both those things. A lot of cameras don't, but this camera does. Now, I'm not big into video shooting, so I'm not using a microphone to record this right now, nor am I using a headphone to check what the volume is. But those are the ports that are on this side. On this side of the body is your card slot cover, and you just slide it forward. Okay, you just slide it forward, and then it'll pop open. And this has what's called dual card slots, meaning it has two, holds two memory cards. Slot 1 is up high, slot 2 is down low, and slot 1 is different from slot 2. Slot 1 has a faster capability of writing to the card. So when you take an image, there's a bunch of data that gets sent to the card. And if it's a raw image, then it's got like a little thumbnail of the image in a JPEG, and then all the raw data, the data gathered by the sensor, and it goes to the card. If it's a JPEG image, the camera processes all that raw data, throws away that data, and just sends you the JPEG image. I have this set up to record raw data, the raw files, to card slot 1, and the JPEG to card slot 2. I don't necessarily use the raw because if the JPEG's good enough and I'm happy with it, I don't need to develop the raw file. But if you need to make changes, if it's too dark or it's too bright, you have more latitude developing the raw file because it has all the data captured to brighten up the dark spots in the image or to make darker the really bright spots. You've got a little more latitude in the raw file than you would have in the JPEG. And another example is the light color, which we call white balance. If your white balance is off, basically meaning like a white sheet of paper would have a tint and not really look white, and you can see that like fluorescent lights have a different tint than incandescent lights, and there are incandescent lights that are called like cool white lights that have a little more of a bluish tint to the light. When you go outside in sunlight, that's a different light tint than when you're inside. The camera tries to automatically figure out the white balance unless you set it manually to something else. And it'll do a great job outside. Great job. In daylight, it'll do a wonderful job getting the white balance right, and the whites will look white. But under some inside light, there may be some tint to the white balance that the camera doesn't quite correct for 100%. And if the camera gets it wrong, it is much easier to adjust that with the raw file. With the raw file, you can just walk through the different white balances, or you can just move them on a scale and find the correct white balance for the shot. So that's why I like to keep the raw file until I've reviewed all the JPEG files. Now the raw files are bigger. They're a lot bigger than the JPEG files, and that's why I record the raw files to the faster card slot. Now it's faster only if you use a faster card. And you see this card has 2 rows of contacts. That's a UHS Class 2 card. And it's also certified as a V60 card, which is faster than a V30 card, slower than a V90 card. Those are the 3 different video specifications for the cards. And I've never had any real problem with using V60s in this camera. They're usually plenty fast enough for recording video, or when you're shooting at a high frame rate, it can still handle the raw file writing to the card. And this camera will shoot at 18 frames a second when you're in silent mode using electronic shutter. Now, card slot 2 is not, it's a UHS 1 instead of UHS 2 class card slot. UHS 1 only has that single row of contacts instead of 2 rows of contacts. So this is a slower card. It's a V30 card. But it's fine for writing the JPEGs too in this camera. Now you can change that, like if you were running out of space you can change those card settings. There's a in the menus, there's a card setup option in the menus, and if you go to that, you can start changing things and you can format your cards. Let me talk about formatting your cards real quick. You can delete an image after you take it, and you just think, okay, that's not a nice image. I don't want to keep that. You can delete it. I have read that you are less likely to get card errors, where the camera gets confused and thinks the card is malfunctioning and will not let you take pictures. You'll get less of those if you never delete the image while the card's in the camera. Just wait until you download it to the computer, download all your images, and then when you put it back in, format your card. And you find that format function in that card setup option in the menus as well. And format completely cleans off the card and reformats it to receive images from this camera. So I've gotten to where I do not delete anything delete anything on the camera until I'm ready to format the card. And with the cards that are in here, the camera's telling me that it estimates you'll get over 6,000 shots with those cards. 6,000 shots. So it may take you a little while before you even need to empty off the card. So, all right. Memory cards. One other thing about that. You see the contacts. They line up with little pins in the card slot. And sometimes you can mess up a card slot by accidentally bending one of those pins. So what you should try to do is get it evenly in, okay, and the card goes in to where when you are looking at the back of the camera, you can see the front side of the card, okay, and then kind of gently push it in with your finger right in the middle of the card, okay, and it will lock into place. You don't have to jam it on in. Once you hear it click into place, you let it go. Same thing for taking it out. You don't have to jam it in or anything. You just slightly push it in. You'll hear it click, and then it will come on out. Okay? So I've never bent a card slot, knock on wood, but it happens to people. So be careful about that. It's one of those things I've read about, so I try to be really careful with it. Now we'll talk about the mode dial on top. This lets you pick your various picture mode settings. And one of those modes is auto, AUTO. That's where the camera does everything for you. It tries to figure out the scene. And it's actually kind of neat. A lot of the digital cameras, in connection with their metering and their auto functions, have stored within their memory thousands of different types of images. So that if you've got it in auto and it sees what looks like a landscape on a bright sunny day, it then applies the settings from the one stored in its memory for that. So that's kind of neat. And I've read that some cameras have as many as 30,000 different photos stored with the correct image parameters for them in their memory. With AI, artificial intelligence, I'm not sure that's necessary anymore on some of the newest cameras. But anyway, I thought it's kind of neat how they do that. So if you're in a setting and you really don't know what your setting should be, flip it over to iAuto. I is supposed to stand for intelligent. So the camera's trying to figure it out. Take a shot or two, see how they look. And you can, when you review the shot, you can review the image settings that were applied. So the shutter speed, the aperture, what picture mode, which is the color, contrast, sharpness, all part of a picture mode. And see if you think maybe if it didn't look good, what maybe should you change from what the camera did, and then you can go to one of the other modes and change those parameters yourself. Okay, after auto on the dial up here, the mode dial is program mode. Program mode lets you pick some of the other parameters like picture mode, but the camera's going to pick out the shutter speed and the aperture. And one dial, one of your front or rear dial, one of the dials when you're in that mode is going to be program shift, meaning, okay, you want to change the aperture. Turn that dial, it's going to try to change the aperture and correspondingly change the shutter speed so that it all still matches the same exposure. And the other dial is going to be exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is a way to brighten or darken the picture. So if you took a picture, it came out too bright, the camera's metering was a little off for that scene, you want it darker, you just dial in negative exposure compensation, and you will see the exposure compensation. You can see right here there's a plus 0.3. I have it dialed in to slightly overexpose an image. But you'll see that number change if you change the exposure compensation. All right. After program mode, which is a P, and I should have mentioned too, there's a little white dot there that you need to line up for whichever mode you're selecting, shooting mode you're selecting with the mode dot. So after the P is A. A is for aperture priority. Aperture we talked about earlier with the old manual lens and the opening in it, and how it can go from big at lower f numbers like f2, f2.8, f4, and the opening gets smaller as you get to bigger numbers, f5.6, f8, f11. Those are smaller and smaller apertures. You want to control the aperture sometimes because you want to control the depth of field, and that's a term used for how far is the area that is in focus. What's the range that will remain in focus and be sharp in your images? If you want your background to be blurry, and people do that a lot for portraits, they want the subject to stand out and the background to not. So you use a wider aperture because it will give you a more shallow depth of field. Focal length of your lens plays into this as well. The longer the focal length of the lens, the shallower the depth of field. But anyway, you're going to want to use wider apertures when you want a narrow area that's in focus, and when you want a really big area that's in focus, like on a landscape shot, you want to use one of those more narrow apertures like f8, maybe f11. You don't want to get past f11 if you want everything in your picture to be sharp, because diffraction sets in. The more narrow the opening gets, and some of that depends on the sensor size and the number of megapixels, so it's kind of complicated. But on these cameras with this sensor, when you get to f8 and beyond, it's going to start setting in. f8, you're not going to notice it, it'll be fine. You may not even notice it at f11, but it definitely takes some sharpness off your image by the time you get to f16. So you want to avoid using those if you can. Now, if you're shooting at night and you're shooting a light trail, for example, of headlights and taillights of cars going by on a highway, and you're up in a hotel room shooting out the window, that's not going to be sharp anyway. And you want a big depth of field there. You want a lot of it in focus. So it's okay in that situation to go ahead and use f11 or f16 to try to keep that deep depth of field, because what you're really recording is just streaks of light, and they're not going to be super sharp. You're going to want everything else dark enough for you to be able to do that you're not picking up much of the surroundings. So that's your kind of caution about getting too carried away with how small an aperture you use. Just because a lens might go to f18 or f22 doesn't mean you should use it. Next on the dial is shutter speed. It's an S, shutter speed priority. Shutter speed, sometimes you want to take control of that because either it's dark and you want to catch this, landscape at night, a pasture at night with some trees at the end of it, and you want it to be bright enough in the picture that you can tell what's there, even though it's really dark outside. Well, you're going to have to use a really long shutter speed to do that. And that's how long the shutter stays open and lets light in. Okay. For fast action, for sports, you've got to use a fast shutter speed to freeze the action. Otherwise, the players are all blurry. And so for kid sports, you might get away with 1/250th of a second, 1/500th, because little kids are slower than big kids. As they get bigger and faster, you have to use faster shutter speeds. For outdoor daylight sports like soccer and football, I like to use 1/1000th or faster, 1/1000th of a second or faster. And in bright sun, that's really not a problem. You can do that without pushing your ISO too high. And again, your ISO is your sensor sensitivity to light. And the reason you're concerned about your ISO getting too high is your sensor has a base ISO, and that's its optimal ISO. That's where it's at its very best. And for most cameras, it's between ISO 100 and ISO 200. On this camera, it's ISO 200. So that's your absolute best image quality. You won't tell much difference when you go to 400 or 800. You'll start really seeing a difference at 1600. At 800, you might, in dark shadows, see a difference indoors and see it more on skin tones than you would objects, that are sharply defined and brightly colored like that. So you want to take control of shutter speed in those kinds of situations. Same thing with motocross. You want to freeze the action for most of your pictures. Now, there may be some where you don't want to freeze the action, so you can see the blur causing the movement, but that's not what you're taking most of the time. But if you did want to see the blur, then you start lowering the shutter speed some until you see just the right amount of blur in the shot, if that's what you want out of your shot. Okay. Indoor sports, the lighting's not as good. You're going to need to use your widest aperture lens, which is this little 25 millimeter Panasonic lens, because it has a wider maximum opening than the two zoom lenses. And even then, the lighting might be so poor that you can't use as fast a shutter speed as you'd like to freeze the action. So you have to do trial and error depending on how the light is where you're at, and see what you get. Now, one trick is to go to black and white, because black and white looks natural grainy. It looks more natural than color pictures do. And when your ISO, your sensor sensitivity, starts getting higher and higher, it's going to introduce more noise into the image, and it may eventually just get splotchy as well. So it degrades your image quality as you get higher and higher with your ISO. In decent light, I'm fine using ISO 800, sometimes ISO 1600 on this camera. I really don't like to use ISO 3200. Although if the light's good and you're using that to just keep a fast shutter speed, then it's not so bad. But if the light's really dark and that's why you're having to do that, it's more likely to show a lot of noise. So anyway, the closer you can stick to the base ISO, the better your image quality will be. But you may not notice it at all in some shots between ISO 200 and ISO 800. Now, there are some lower ISOs available. Those are not optimal either. They also degrade your image quality just a little bit from using the ISO 200. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can use auto ISO. I use that a lot. I let the camera pick the ISO, but you can set a range for that, and I think the camera lets you set it with a maximum ISO of 6400. I prefer to keep that down to 32 or 1600, but sometimes just capturing the image is better than not being able to capture the image, even if the image is going to be grainy. When looked at full size, it may not look good, but when you reduce it or you run it through noise removal software, it may clean up and look nice. So if you have to use a high ISO, use it. See if you can make the image usable afterward. Let me talk about software while we're talking about this. There is a free software. You may have to put in the serial number of the camera, called OM Workspace. OM. O is in orange, M is in mango, Workspace. And it used to be Olympus Workspace. Olympus changed its name to OM on the camera division. It is made specifically for Olympus cameras. If you install OM Workspace and then connect via your USB-C port to the computer while you've got OM Workspace open, OM Workspace will import your images. And while there's other software out there that's free for adjusting JPEGs that I like, and I'll tell you the one I like for JPEG, it's called Faststone, in one word, Faststone, one word, Faststone Image Viewer. Really neat for editing JPEGs. It lets you do batch conversions of different image settings. Let's say they came out undersaturated, you wanted to just add some color saturation to all the images you took. You can just select all and go into the batch convert menu and select image adjustments, and you can add saturation, and then you can preview what it would look like. And then you just convert all those images. What it means by convert is it processes them with that adjustment, so you get the more saturated images that you want. And Faststone is free. It's a free download. I've been using it for years. It's really good for free software for JPEG editing. It's not really made to be a RAW converter. Although it will let you open raw images, it will open them at half the size of what they actually are. But OM Workspace, that software is made to import and adjust your raw images. So if you needed to change your white balance, for example, or you needed to change your exposure some, and technically the exposure is established when you take the image, and it's the light you let in through the lens. It is the shutter speed you used for how long the shutter was left open to collect light, and technically that's the exposure. Now with digital cameras and ISO being able to change on sensors, a lot of folks call it an exposure triangle and throw the ISO in there as well, because it plays a part in the brightness of the image. So you can think of it as a triangle. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO is what leads to your exposure. And once that image is taken, you can't really change that, but you've got more latitude to adjust the brightness and the darkness with your raw file in software like OM Workspace. It will do a pretty good job with that. Now, something like white balance, that's just a setting that gets applied to that raw data, easy to change that in the software, in the OM Workspace software. Hard to change it on a JPEG because you don't have all the underlying data. It's already applied a white balance to the JPEG and then thrown away the data necessary to be able to change the white balance. Okay, we got through shutter speed priority. After that is manual on the mode dial. That lets you pick the aperture and the shutter speed. When you're in manual, there's some other functions while you're going through shutter speed that are kind of neat. When you go to the slow end of shutter speeds, and your shutter speeds are typically going to show up on the screen as like a 60, okay, meaning 1/60th of a second, or 100, meaning 1/100th of a second. And then as you get down to the real slow end, you start getting to a half second, a full second, multiple seconds. And when you get past all that, there's the option called bulb. Bulb is when you press your shutter release button and hold it down, it's going to keep the shutter open until you let it go. Okay, so that's bulb mode. So that's when you're in really dark conditions, you want a very long exposure. Olympus also has a feature called live time, and in live time you press once to open the shutter and let it go, and the shutter just stays open. It's unlike bulb, you don't have to keep pressing, and then you press it again to close the shutter. And in live time, you'll gradually see the additional brightness being added to the image. Okay, and then there's one called live composite. Live composite is for something like fireworks. Okay, when you use live composite, it would prompt you to take one shot so it can establish where all the existing light is in the scene. Okay, so let's say there's a street light and it's going to be in the scene that you're shooting fireworks in. It will record that street light and know that it's there, but it doesn't need to be added again in a long exposure. And in live composite, what it does is it takes a series of long exposures, like 1 second, followed by another 1 second, followed by another 1 second. And it adds the new light that might appear. So a firework explodes here, it gets added. Street light down here, still the same as it was. Because if it keeps adding light from the street light then gets way blown out. It gets overexposed and it doesn't look right. But when these fireworks appear, that's new light in the scene, and it will add those. But once it's added here, it's not going to add another firework right on top of that of the same color. It knows, hey, this is already here now, don't add any more to it because it can get too bright and blow up. So live composite is a really good function for firework photos. I've used it some. After that on the mode dial, after manual, we get to the custom function settings. You'll see C1, C2, and C3. Those are where you can go in, set all your settings, and like I said, for sports, I want a fast shutter speed, okay? And I know for sports that I like to use the natural picture mode, okay, which is one of the color settings. And I can go ahead and set that in. I can set contrast, sharpness, any parameters I want specifically for sports. And once I've got all those dialed in, then I go into the menus, and it's the very first menu option. It will look like, after you hit menu, it will look like a camera with a 1 beside it. So that's like shooting mode 1. And the first option is to save or reset your custom modes. And I can save that sports settings as either C1, C2, or C3. And then if I know I'm going out to shoot sports, I just flip it over to C3, and it's already got my settings in there. Same thing, you might want different settings for portraits. Like that natural picture mode that I like for outside sports. A little more saturated than I want for portraits. Because faces get too red, they don't look normal. So I might use muted as the picture mode. Or portrait. There is a portrait picture mode. I actually like muted better than portrait for taking portraits for skin tones. But you can set it up the way you want it. Shutter speed that you might want, and if you're taking a portrait, they're not running, so I don't need a fast shutter speed. And then I can save those settings to a custom mode. And then the next time I want to take a portrait, I can just flip over to what custom mode I assign that to. So you've got 3 on the mode dial that you can assign if you want to save settings in a custom mode. After the custom modes is video or movie mode, and that actually just kind of looks a little bit like a movie projector. That's for shooting your movies. That I have set to save to card 1 because card 1 is fastest. And movies are basically taking 30 pictures a second if you're set on 30p. So 4K 30p means it's sized perfectly for a 4K TV. And 30p means it's taking 30 images per second. You can, in some cameras, shoot at higher frames per second. And if you were recording really fast action, or you wanted to be able to do slow motion, then you have to record at higher frames per second for your movies. But standard, and the one that will give you really good quality here, is the 4K 30p. And because that's sending a lot of data to the memory card, I have it set to use the faster card slot. That's going to fill that card up at some point if you're shooting very long. So you may need a spare card. I'm going to try to remember to put a spare card in, but it will not necessarily be as fast a card as what you would like for movies. For movies, I like to use a V60 card, and that's what I've got in slot 1, is a V60 card. Now, after the movie mode is your art modes, and it literally says art, A-R-T. Those are artistic modes of all different kinds. Some will look like a watercolor painting. Some will just look like really oversaturated, okay, to make everything pop out. Really oversaturated is nice on a really cloudy, dull looking day where you don't have very good light and you still want colors to pop. So the very first art mode may help in that situation. The art mode I like is single color. In single color art mode, you can pick one color that will show up as that color, and everything else will show up black and white. So let's say one of your sisters is wearing a yellow dress and you want that yellow dress to really pop. You can use that single color mode, one color mode, and pick yellow as the color, and the dress will show up as yellow and everything else will show up as black and white unless there's other yellow things in the scene. So, if there's a yellow cup somewhere, well, it would show up as yellow. If there's a yellow car, it would show up as yellow too. But it's a neat tool to be able to make something stand out, that make it really pop. It wouldn't necessarily otherwise pop in the picture. All right. Front dial, okay. Rear dial. Those two dials, when you're shooting, you're in a shooting mode, those two dials are generally going to change your aperture and shutter speed. If you're in shutter speed mode, only one dial changes shutter speed. The other dial is not going to impact aperture, but instead the other dial will likely show up as your exposure compensation dial. And you can set these functions in the menus, and that's usually the way I have them set up. I haven't checked that I've gone through every one of these because I usually just use manual. And in manual, one dial shutter speed, the other dial's aperture. Okay. When you're not in a shooting mode, when you're in the menus, you can use these to move around in the menus. When you are picking your focus area, and there are a couple of buttons that get you into your focus area, like that. When you're picking your focus area, the front dial changes, it scrolls you through the available areas, okay? The rear dial, if you can see over there to the left, you can see a little face. The rear dial will scroll you through your face detection options, from off to detect faces, to detect face and eye, and try to focus on an eye. So you change those with the rear dial. And so if you wanted to change your face detection very fast, you just hit this button for your focus areas and then scroll that rear dial till you've got face detection where you want it, on or off. And then just hit the shutter button, the menu goes away. When you half press the shutter button, your camera's going to focus, and it will take you out of any menu modes that you're on. Okay. On the back side of the camera, there's an info button. When you are in shooting mode, it will cycle you through the displays that are available, including one that doesn't show any information. So if you're trying to be really careful about your framing, that will be the mode you might want to use, with none of the information blocking any of your scene. So the info button does that. Now when you're reviewing images, and I don't actually have any images on here right now, the cards are clean, but when you're reviewing images, the info button also will scroll you through different information that's available for your images. Okay. The red button's your video record button right there. You can change the function assigned to that if you want to something else. But if you're going to record very many movies, it's better to just leave that as your video record button. If you assign something else to it, then you just switch to the movie mode on the dial and use your shutter release to start recording and use it again to stop recording. Next to it is the function 2 button. You see a little squiggly line there. You can assign different functions to that. I have the shadow and highlight control assigned to that, so that when I touch it, you get that little screen that comes up, and then you use the 2 control dials. The front one controls the highlight adjustments, the rear one controls the shadow adjustments. And if you hit the function button while you have that little screen up, that lets you change the midtones. So if you want the bright areas of the image to not be quite as bright, you lower them. If you want them to be brighter, you raise them. Same thing with the shadows. You can lower them, and the curve will start looking like that. Or you can raise them, and it'll look like that. And the same thing with the midtones. You can brighten the midtones, you can darken the midtones some. So that's controlling your shadow and highlights, and that's what that emblem stands for, and that's what I have assigned to that button. Now, over on the side of the body is the function 1 button, and you see those dots, line of vertical dots, a line of horizontal dots. Those are setting your autofocus points. So what areas are you going to be using for autofocus? And when you hit that screen comes up, and as I mentioned earlier, you can scroll through that using the front dial, and that's using all the autofocus points right there. So when you use all autofocus points, the camera's picking out what it's going to focus on. It's usually going to find the closest subject that it thinks is a subject. But if you've got face detection turned on, it's just looking for a face within those areas. Okay, I mentioned earlier there's this function lever, and on that function lever there are multiple options. I have it assigned to switch between 2 different autofocus settings. But you can go in the menus and you can find the other options and decide what you want to use for that. Now, you see the OK button. Pressing the OK button brings up what's called the Super Control Panel. And then within that panel, you can use these buttons that surround it to move around in there. And if you hit OK again, that brings up whatever that setting is and lets you change it. Now, these are all permanent. You can't modify what any of these are, but when you hit it, it will bring up whatever function you're on. So like that shadow and highlight control screen, if I hit OK on that icon for it, it brings up that screen. Okay, if I get out of that, we talked earlier about how these buttons can be assigned different functions. And if you can see, there's a little cog that's now highlighted in green. And then up here, it tells you button function. Well, sorry, Super Control Panel went away before it showed you that. Button function up at the top. That tells you if you press on that, you're going to go to the button function menu right here. And what it shows you is what those functions are what those buttons are currently assigned as functions. And if you want to change those, you just scroll around to the one you want to change, and then hit the directional arrow beside the OK button to the right, and it'll show you what you currently have assigned. And then you can use the up and down buttons above and below OK to scroll through all the options. And there are a lot of options. So for any button that is programmable, that's how you go through them. Now these 4 buttons themselves, when you are not within a menu, okay, these 4 buttons can be set up to be directional buttons to move your autofocus points. But I don't have it set up that way. So if you want to use it that way, you'll have to go in the menus and change that so that those will be directional buttons. I have it set up as what it calls in the menus direct function. And that means 2 of those buttons are now programmable. The other 2 are already set by Olympus. The button on top is set to bring up being able to adjust exposure compensation. Button on the left is set up to bring up all your focus settings. So it's the same thing this button does. So if you're going to leave those as function buttons, feel free to reassign that one to something else, because now it's assigned to 2 different buttons. But the default for this one is your autofocus area. So and they call it autofocus target. So I just left the default on that one for you. But when you use direct function setting for these now, so you've got exposure compensation on the top button, you've got autofocus target on the left button, and then you get to assign whatever you want on the bottom button. I have that set to the sequential shooting modes, meaning you pick whether or not you shoot one shot when you press the shutter button, or does it fire continuously. And if you choose continuous, which shows multiple little rectangles, if it's got H beside it, that means the continuous high setting. If it's got a heart beside it, that means silent mode, electronic shutter. And let me tell you why I like to use silent mode. The mechanical shutter is moving physical parts, okay? The electronic shutter is just powering on, recording the scene on the sensor without any mechanical moving parts. So electronic shutter puts less wear and tear on your camera, and all shutters have a lifespan. At some point in time, if they're used enough, they're going to fail. Now, that may be 200,000 shutter actuations of mechanical shutter. It may be 400,000 or 500,000. It just varies by camera and by how fast your shutter speeds are and things like that. It just kind of all different things play into it. But with electronic shutter, you're not putting the wear and tear on your mechanical shutter. Plus, you're silent. You're shooting silently. So if you're taking a picture of your littlest sister asleep, silent's a good thing. If you're at a very quiet event but want to take pictures, like a christening at church, silent again is a good mode to be in. So I like to use the ones with the heart beside them. And there's another advantage to it in that the mechanical shutter isn't capable of firing as fast as the electronic shutter. So with electronic shutter, you get a higher frame rate. Your maximum frame rate with autofocus that continues to change as you're shooting. So if you had a moving subject, is 18 frames a second in electronic shutter. Your autofocus maxes out at 10 or 12 frames a second when you're in mechanical shutter with autofocus. Now, if you aren't using continuous focus, if you're using single focus where you half press and your focus then locks, wherever your focus points at, it grabs something, locks onto it, it gives you confirmation that you've obtained autofocus. There's a little green dot that'll show up. And that doesn't happen in continuous, because in continuous, focus is constantly changing because your subject's moving. But if you're using single autofocus, your maximum frame rate is up to 60 frames in a second, 60 shots in a second. So if you were trying to catch a water drop hitting water and then the splash, you'd want it well lit so you could use a really fast shutter speed. Because if your shutter speed is anything less than 1/60th of a second, you obviously can't take 60 frames. So you need a fast shutter speed, and you need enough light to be able to do that. But you could shoot up to 60 frames in a single second using single shot autofocus. So electronic shutter, really, really fast on this camera. Now, below that is your menu button. Okay, that brings up the main menus on the camera. And I'm already scrolled in. It brings you back to the last place you were, but that would be like the first menu setting. And sometimes it will tell you to back up in the menus to hit the menu button, or to get out of the menus, just hit the menu button again. But it will also take you out of the menus to half press the shutter release. So below that is your play button. Okay, the blue with the triangle, that's your play button. So that will play back your images and your videos. And in your videos, you'll have to hit OK to start playing them. In your images, and I probably should have taken a picture so I could show you this, but I didn't take any pictures. When you, on these memory cards, when you're reviewing images, you can scroll through the images using your front control dial. It will go to either the preceding or the next image, depending on which direction you turn it. And you magnify the image with your rear dial. Okay, so you can zoom in. You can move it around with the directional buttons. So, and then there's the trash button. That's for deleting images. And as I mentioned earlier, you're less likely to get a card error if you don't delete images. So just try not to do that. And you may not get an error from deleting them, but I have gotten a few card errors with cameras over the years. I don't remember if I've ever gotten a card error with the Olympus camera, but when it has happened, I just download what's on the card, clean the card off, reformat it, and then it works fine after that. Okay, so we've covered that side of the body. On this side, there's an icon that's also programmable to different functions, that is to the left of the electronic viewfinder, and it will toggle you between different screen views. It can be set up to toggle between here and the EFV, but there's a sensor at the EFV that will automatically switch it there, and I use that auto setting, and then I program something else to this. Yes, I do have it programmed to bracketing instead of switching between viewfinders or switching from the viewfinder normal screen to super control panel, because the OK button brings up the super control panel. So I put bracketing on this, and the bracketing that I use is called the art mode bracketing. What art mode bracketing does is it lets you apply different picture modes, and including all the art modes, to each shot you take. So you press the shutter once like you're taking a single image, but the camera then generates a JPEG for each mode you selected. And I like using that because I like black and white as well as color. So I can have it set to take a black and white picture plus whatever color mode I want. And sometimes I want two color modes. I want a more vibrant one and I want one that's more muted. So I might have it set for natural, muted, okay, and black and white. And in art bracketing mode, when I push that button and turn on art bracketing, it gives me those three images from a single shot. And then when I put it on the computer, I just delete what I don't want. Now, there's other kinds of bracketing. There's exposure bracketing, where it'll take a shot overexposed, a shot as metered, or a shot underexposed, and you set the parameters as to how much you want it to overexpose and how much you want it to underexpose and how many shots you want it to take for that kind of bracketing. And there's other things like white balance bracketing as well. But if you shoot with a raw image, if you keep a raw image, you don't really need to balance your white bracket because you can change that quite easily with the raw file. So that's the bracketing that I like, and I have that assigned to that button just to the left of the electronic viewfinder. Okay. In your sequential shooting options, I need to mention there's an option called Pro Capture, and that only works with certain pro lenses. So you might not have that available to you, but what it does is it starts recording images when you start focusing, and then it saves. Once you press the shutter button down to take a picture, it will save all the images it actually took, and that has to be an electronic shutter for this to work, or silent mode. It will save all the images for a specified period of time. So you might, I use it for soccer, and I use it set at a half second. So when I press the shutter release, as long as I was focusing for at least a half second before I pressed it, and this is your cousin Penelope, it will save all the images in the half second before me fully pressing the shutter release. And so here, if I was shooting at 18 frames a second, what it's going to give me is 9 shots that happened immediately prior to me fully depressing the shutter release. And I do that because our reaction time can be a little slow. The camera itself has a very tiny delay between you pressing and it actually taking. And I might miss what I wanted, and that's usually the ball on her foot. When she's kicking the ball, I want the ball right on her foot as she's kicking through. And it's real easy to miss that and be just a little late. And this Pro Capture allows you to capture those images prior to fully pressing down to help ensure I get that shot. So it's a neat function. It's one that if you wanted to shoot at the highest rates and you needed one of the Olympus Pro lenses to do it, well, you'd either have to rent or borrow or buy a compatible lens with it. And there's a list online that you can find of the lenses that work with Pro Capture. Okay, let's see what else I needed to remember to tell you about. Oh, I didn't talk about the AE lock, AF lock. That's auto exposure lock, auto focus lock button that's in the middle of this little lever. What that button does is it will lock your exposure and it will lock your autofocus when you press it. That's the default function. You can assign other functions to this. I've left it at the default for now, but you can assign anything you want to that's in the menus as available functions to assign. Talk some about that lever, and then I like to use it to switch between two different autofocus modes. So you just, while the lever's in one position, set the autofocus the way you want it, flip the lever to the other position, set the autofocus to what you want it to be in that position, and then as you flip back and forth, it changes your autofocus settings. The good use of that, in my opinion, is to set one at a smallest little autofocus point. So if there's something you really, really want to focus on that's off in the distance and it's small, and you need to use that really small autofocus point to get that pinpoint focus on that one thing. That's nice for one setting for me. And then on the other setting, I'll use a little bigger focus area, maybe something that would cover a face. If I'm shooting sports, I actually use a vertical area that I designed myself, because the autofocus, when you're in the autofocus menus, you can actually create your own shapes as far as how wide and how high the autofocus target area will be. And shooting soccer, I do one that's kind of human shaped, that's taller than it is wide. It'll just fit right over the person that I'm shooting, and grab focus there. And so that's the way sometimes I'll have the second one set up, the second autofocus set up to use this lever. Let me see if there's anything else here that I have forgotten. We covered the art modes. And let me tell you what I did just to go through the art modes. Rather than going in and changing the mode every time, I just clicked every one of them, took one shot, and then just compared the different art modes and decided which ones I might use and which ones I might not. So that's one way to do it. And then, like I mentioned earlier, I use the bracketing. I have the bracketing set up. And I think that's it. I think that's enough for now. I'm sending you, if they'll fit in Grandma's bag, I'm sending you a couple of lenses. One of those lenses has a macro function, meaning you can take a more close-up picture with greater magnification. So that's a neat function to have. Now, that lens also has a focus clutch where you can go from manual focus back to auto. I always manage to accidentally change that, and I don't usually want to be in manual focus, so I normally have that turned off in the camera, because you can turn that off in the menu, so it should be turned off. On your lenses, you got a front cap, you got a rear cap. You want to keep those on because there's metal contacts for the communication with the camera that need to be protected, and you're trying to keep that glass element as clean as possible on the end. Now, on your lenses, you can use a microfiber cloth to wipe off the glass, but you want to blow it first to try to get anything gritty off of it that might scratch. So blowing is better than wiping on your lens element. And you got one kind of normal range zoom that's a 12 to 50 millimeter. That was the kit lens purchased with the camera. And then the other is a 40 to 150, which gives you a lot longer range. This is more of a telephoto lens if you were out shooting a football or shooting soccer or something like that. This lens gives you a lot of range to do that, and it will extend out like that when you zoom. Okay, this is a really, really good lens for an inexpensive small zoom lens. This kit lens I don't think is quite as sharp throughout the range as the 40 to 150, but it does have the macro function, and it is supposed to be weather sealed. Now, the camera is supposed to be weather sealed as well. I wouldn't go shoot in pouring rain unless I had the camera and the lens somewhat protected. But if you get caught in a shower, the camera and the lens, if you've got a weather sealed lens like this one, the 40 to 150 zoom is not weather sealed. The Panasonic 25mm is not weather sealed. But this is the lens you're going to use when you're inside because it has wider aperture available than either of the zoom lenses. Okay. But I said, if you get caught in a rain shower, the camera should survive. You want to put them in a really dry place. You want to keep them as dry as you can when you store them. Don't, if you're out in the rain, I might use a baggie to cover up stuff, cut the end out of it. But don't store them in a baggie because that's sealing in moisture and not letting them dry out. Lenses, if they get too wet and don't get promptly dried out, can grow fungus, and the fungus eats away at the elements in the lens and will ruin your lens over time. So it is important that even though these are supposed to be weather sealed, to get them dried out if they get wet. Put them in a real dry place, and heck, you could put them in with a bag of rice that will suck up moisture and help get the moisture content lower inside your lenses. And I think that's it, buddy. I think you'll have a lot of fun with this. If you prefer SLR, a bigger digital SLR, and it's big and heavy, but it's got great image quality. It doesn't have nearly as many focus options, but it has a bigger sensor, a much bigger sensor, and that helps with better pictures in lower light in particular because the high ISO is cleaner with the bigger sensor. I have a Nikon D610, and I have some pretty good lenses for it. I have a 24 to 85 zoom that's a good lens. I have an 85mm f1.4 that is an old lens, but a very good portrait lens, and a lens good at blurring the background. So if this doesn't work for you, let me know. And if you want to try the digital SLR, then we'll just trade them out. You can trade me this one back for the digital SLR and go from there. All right. Merry Christmas. I hope it's a great one. Miss you. Love you. Bye for now.